Well, shall we open our Bibles this morning to Mark chapter 14, verse 53? And if you've already found that, we're going to be flipping over to John chapter 18 in a moment. So if you can kind of find that and mark that, it'll kind of save you a moment. So we continue our studies through Mark's gospel, and we are with Jesus and the boys on that night before the Lord was to die. Late Thursday night for us, Friday morning for the Jewish calendar. And Mark's interest, as we've told you before, was that Jesus was a servant. He learned about Jesus from Peter. He was too young to be around. In fact, he mentions that in our study last week, down the last couple of verses there. But Mark was very moved by the Lord's doing. And so his book is filled with Jesus doing in the middle of the night, in the afternoon, when people weren't listening, always reaching out, not really put off by the reactions or the circumstances. And as you get towards the cross, Mark wants to focus on two things in particular: Jesus' willingness to die because he came to serve and to save, and that he is God. He is in charge of all that takes place. And so he in his gospel, more than others, focuses on those two things. In our study last week, we were at Gethsemane, and the Lord was arrested by what would be Judas and maybe 1,000 folks, 600 Roman soldiers. And this morning we pick up the story with Mark as Jesus now goes to these trials that took place during the night. If you leave with anything this morning, I hope you'll leave with a couple of things. Number one, there is this exchange that took place between you and I and the Lord in the sense that he is the innocent one and we're not. And yet he was treated as the guilty party. You will read in the Gospels constantly how he was not guilty. Everyone involved said he's not guilty. Everyone did. Now, he didn't let him go, because it was the Father's purpose to have him die. That's the first part. The other part is there's a great lesson in this for how you deal with things that are unfair in your life. Because I think there's a few things that frustrate us as much as, oh, that wasn't fair, that wasn't right, that wasn't good, that, I got the raw end of that stick, so to speak. And yet as you watch these trials, Jesus got the wrong end of everything. But he does so with purpose, trusting the Father. So 6 trials, and here's the big picture, not the lesson, but the big picture. There are 6 trials that take place during this night before we get to the dawn where Jesus is sent off. About 6 in the morning, Pilate will hand Jesus over to be crucified. He'll be on the cross at 9 in the morning. But before that, sometime after the Last Supper, during those hours of late Thursday into Friday, 6 trials take place. They're all illegal. They're all illegal by anybody's standards. They are fake trials, if you want to call them that. There are 3 of them in front of the religious leaders, one before Annas, one before Caiaphas, who had a bunch of guys with him, and then one in the morning, or at least towards dawn, with the entire Sanhedrin to issue official charges that they hope would get Rome to put Jesus to death. Then there are 3 trials in front of the civil trials, or if you will, before the government, before Pilate, who sends them to Herod in hopes of getting off the hook, and then back to Pilate, who ultimately follows through. We're going to try to take a look at those in the next few weeks. There's lots to learn. We will look at the first couple of them in front of the religious leaders this morning. But like I said, none of these trials are legal. These are all accomplished by the Lord because he's the innocent one who stands for the guilty. He hasn't broken any laws. He's committed no crime besides just being perfect in all of his ways. The mob had taken him. He had gone willingly. Now, you should know, even from a Jewish standpoint, that for Jewish law in the first century, you couldn't hold a capital offense trial at night. You couldn't hold it on a feast day. You couldn't hold it on a Sabbath. They just about broke every rule, trying to get their will accomplished. You couldn't coerce a defendant to speak as they did Jesus. You couldn't get him to testify against himself. You had to have witnesses that would agree with one another. Jesus' arrest was the result of blood money and a bribe. I mean, everything just stacks against fair here. But yet, he went through it for us. The law continues, and it said that you couldn't, if you convicted someone of an offense that was worthy of death, that sentencing could not take place the same day. There had to be an appeals, at least from Jewish law. So all of these procedures, none of them were intended to determine the truth. Nobody cared. They were intended to accomplish the will of the law of the Lord and to, I think, reveal the hearts of men. I mean, the Sanhedrin, this Jewish council, had decided several years before that they would put Jesus to death, that he had to die, that he was a big threat to their popularity and to their jobs and to their power base. Pilate will say that he understood that their motive was envy. The plots that followed, revealed that. These guys would make up charges. They would hire false witnesses. They would bring Jesus to Pilate. They would try to rally the people to cry for him over that fellow Barabbas that should have died. He was a wicked man. They would threaten Pilate with political upheaval if he didn't do what they said, and they were able politically to put great pressure on him. And they would mock Jesus when he hung on the cross. This wasn't a trial. This wasn't a trial. None of these things are trials. This is premeditated murder. But it is the will of the Father that his Son would die for the sins of man. So Jesus knew this, right? You can read in Luke 18 that on the way up to Jerusalem, the Lord said, we're going to Jerusalem, and everything that has been written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man is going to be accomplished. He's going to be delivered to the Gentiles. He's going to be mocked and insulted and spit upon. They're going to scourge him. They're going to kill him. On the third day, he is going to rise again. God knew. Peter on Pentecost stood up on his first recorded sermon, certainly, and he said there in chapter 2, I think it's verse 23 of Acts, about Jesus, that he had been taken or delivered, if you will, by the determinate purposes and foreknowledge of God. But wicked, lawless hand had taken him and crucified him and put him to death. But Peter starts by saying, God had this in control. This was God's way of saving you and I. This was God's sacrifice. Nothing had gone wrong. This wasn't a mistake. The enemy didn't get the upper hand. This didn't get away from him. This was all part of God's purpose and plan. So over the next couple of weeks as we study, but in a contextual stance, over the next several hours, there's a whole lot of these Old Testament prophecies that become fulfilled all at once. It's almost like the door is open from his treatment to his death to the resurrection. The entire kind of Old Testament prophetic picture of his first coming kind of lays out before us very quickly. Isaiah had written in chapter 50, the Lord saying, I've given my back to the smiters. I've given my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I didn't hide my face from their shame and their spitting. I set my face like a flint. I won't be ashamed. And we see this worked out here as we go through these mock trials and these beatings and the horrible treatment that the Lord would receive on our behalf. So the ropes couldn't hold him. The chains didn't hold him either. And the 1,000 people who stood up really couldn't take him. But something more powerful kept him there. His love for the Father, his love for you and I. So as we leave the garden this morning with Jesus, we head back up to Jerusalem, which means down the Mount of Olives again, across the Kidron Valley again, up the other side through the temple gates and back into town. 3 trials. And it starts with Annas. Now, if you'll kind of hold your context here and turn with me before we read what Mark has to write, because Mark picks up the second portion. Let's go to John chapter 18, verse 12. And hopefully you've been able to find that in just a couple of minutes. We just want to kind of get the context from John so we can get the whole chronology kind of set in our minds. John 18, verse 12. It says this, now the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews who arrested Jesus had bound him. And notice it says they led him away to Annas first. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas, who had advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man would die for the people. Annas and Caiaphas were really the two wicked men that are behind kind of the impetus to this whole mockery and this whole trial, this whole plan. Annas, historically, was the high priest from 6 AD through 15 AD. He was definitely the power broker. If you called Annas the godfather, you'd be right. I mean, he's the fella that owned and operated with his family all of the things that went on at the temple, the selling of offerings, the exchanging of money, if you will. They were the merchandisers who, when people came to Jerusalem to worship the Lord according to the law, on those feast days, rather than running into a God who loved them and was represented as such, they would run into these greedy bunch of guys who were out to rip them off. And as a result, people would come to worship and be turned away by these greedy guys. That still happens today, doesn't it? You know, people need to know the Lord that we know, who loves them and is a kind God and a good God. And instead they run into these misrepresentations of God. Oftentimes with guys with their money, you know, is what they want is your money. They got their hand in your pocket or their hand out. So Annas was responsible for when you came and brought your offering to Jerusalem, your lamb for your sins, that the priests would find a flaw in yours, but they would have a good one on sale for you. And what you had brought along would no longer be acceptable. And if you had money, it had to be exchanged into the temple kind of tribute, because your money had Caesar's picture on it, and for a 20% turnaround, we can do that for you. And so they became rich, the people became poor, the relationship between God and the people was absolutely hindered, and they never learned about his love from his representatives, these folks that should have been serving at the priesthood. So by Old Testament law, the high priest was to serve for life. He was chosen by God. But that had been greatly corrupted by the time you come to Jesus' day and by the time that the Romans ruled. The Romans, according to history, hated Annas. They didn't deal well with him. They didn't get along with him. And so they told him they didn't want to deal with him, and they put Caiaphas in his place. The Romans replaced the high priests, if you will, and so his son-in-law took that seat. But make no mistake, Annas is the power broker behind it all. He's the godfather for this family. And notice we read here in verse 13, that's where they went first. They went to Annas' house first. Annas ruled this position for years through his sons, 5 of them, a son-in-law, and Caiaphas would actually stay in this job until the year that Pilate got shipped out because they couldn't trust him, and Rome recalled him, and Caiaphas disappeared that same year from the scene. Jesus had lots of run-ins with Caiaphas, not the least of which was at the beginning and the end of his ministry. You might remember he cleansed the temple, right, and turned over tables and called what they were doing, making the Father's house a den of thieves. This should be a house of prayer. So they hated Jesus, and they certainly wanted to get rid of him, particularly at the beginning and the end of, like I said, of his ministry. You remember he made those whips and he chased the money changers out. Annas was no happy camper when it came to Jesus, who had confronted his wickedness. I always like when I have a chance to go talk to at pastors' conferences, especially young pastors, to talk to them about Jesus' cleansing of the temple, because I think any practices that you develop in the church where your focus is raising money or making profit, you've missed God's heart. God wants us to gather together to honor him. He'll make the provision. He always has. That's not something that falls, I think, on anybody's shoulders. I think you go out and you preach Jesus and teach his word, and God will provide. So it should be a place of worship. Well, Jesus has taken notice to the grandfather first, the power behind the throne. Now, you should know that they both lived together in a palace separated by a courtyard, kind of 2 wings of a very large building, and their offices were basically in the same place. But they went over to Annas' side first, and I don't doubt that Caiaphas may very well have been in attendance, but the purpose was they now needed to formulate charges against Jesus that would stick. They didn't want him arrested, they wanted him dead. And they knew how it operated in Rome, and they knew what it might take to bring charges against him. So they wanted authorization eventually from Pilate to get Jesus murdered. And so they take him to Annas. Now, interestingly, verse 14, John mentions to us that Caiaphas had at a meeting kind of unwittingly, I should say, unknowingly prophesied that Jesus' death for man would be something that would take place. If you can go back in John, I think it's chapter 11, and he said at the meeting when he was the high priest that year, you'll read, you don't know anything at all. It is expedient, or it would be great, or it would be beneficial for us that one person should die for the people, not that the whole nation perish. And it says he didn't say this of his own authority, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied Jesus would die for the nation, and not just for that nation, but for all nations. So he did it without knowing it, but John said, this is the guy that is now saying he's going to make decisions about Jesus' life and death. But John throws in early on, hey, even before this gets started, he's already the one that talked about his death, because the Lord is in charge behind the scenes in every way. And so he points it out here as well. If you skip down to verse 19, because in the middle is Peter's denial, which we'll talk about next week. But down in verse 19 it says, then the high priest asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I spoke openly in the world. I always taught in the synagogues and the temple where the Jews are always meeting. In secret I've done nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I've said. Now, like I said, it does appear that this, in context, that John, verse 24, it says, notice it says, Annas then sent Jesus to Pilate bound, who was the high priest. It does appear from the Gospels that Jesus met first with Annas alone. Can these trials overlap? Certainly. But I want you to just look at the interrogation. This is the first one that began. And here in verse 19, notice that the first question was if Jesus might identify himself, right? That he might speak about his disciples and about his doctrine. Now, Jesus says nothing about his disciples. He is interested in protecting them. He answers nothing. It's not about them, it's about him. When he's asked about his doctrine, his answers are pretty straightforward. He said, I haven't talked in secret. I don't have any hidden agendas. I've been teaching openly for 3 years. I've spent the whole week, this last week, in the synagogue where the Jews are all gathering. I've spoken openly and clearly. I'm not at all doing what you guys have been doing in these secret meetings and in hushed tones and the lights turned down, and meeting in the middle of the night looking to destroy someone. I've always just, been clear. And then the Lord says, and he calls attention to the legality of the trials. He said, why don't you bring in some witnesses? Bring in someone who's heard what I speak. I got nothing to hide. Bring in some folks, they'll tell you what I said and what I taught. Bring some eyewitnesses, they'll confirm. Verse 22 tells us here in John that when he had said these things, one of the officers that were standing by him struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, slapped him in the face. How do you answer the high priest like that? He said. And Jesus said, if I've spoken evil, then bear witness of my evil. But if I've spoken well or correctly, why are you hitting me or striking me? So I thought about this guy. I thought, I wonder how he's going to feel on the day that he stands before Jesus on Judgment Day. Frightening, isn't it? Like I said, Matthew and Luke tell us that Caiaphas and Annas lived in the same palace with, like I said, only the courtyard in between where we'll find Peter. But according to verse 24 here in John, it does seem like Jesus met with Annas first before he was sent in his chains across the way to the current holder of the high priest office. So there is one who by law, Old Testament law, would have the position of the high priest. So it's been corrupted, and there was one that Rome recognized. All right, with that being said, let's go back to Mark. You guys are doing very well. to verse 53, where we join this second meeting. Because now we read, and they led Jesus away to the high priest. That was now Caiaphas. And when they were assembled with all of the chief priests and the elders and the scribes, Peter followed afar off at a distance, went right into the courtyard of the high priest. Like I said, the purpose of this meeting was to get people to come up with ways to blame Jesus or point their finger at him when it came to the Romans and their law. Notice from verse 53 that everyone's up this night. All of the religious guys who should have been really preparing their hearts before the Lord for the Passover, one of the holiest weeks of the year, but they're all scheming and plotting, and they're going to secret meetings, and they got Jesus in handcuffs, and they're taking advantage of him. He's getting slapped in the face, and these guys are all, they're all feeling like they're pretty much in charge. But they want to, with all of these Sanhedrin members and religious leaders, in the late hours, they just come to just kind of get some, something on paper that they can use against them. These are despicable kind of plotting folks. And according to the law, Deuteronomy 19, one of the things that the law required was if you're going to accuse someone of something, you need to have two witnesses that would agree or to corroborate. In the mouth of two or three witnesses, everything will be established. So these guys are trying very hard to accommodate the law while plotting an innocent man's death on the Passover. It's just as crazy as it can possibly be. Well, we're going to save verse 54 for next week. You should just underline the words, he followed at a distance, and just know that when you follow the Lord at a distance, you're liable to get in trouble. Right? Don't follow at a distance. But Peter had made promises he was trying to live up to. Verse 55. Now the chief priests and all of the council had sought testimony against Jesus to have him put to death. That was their purpose. But notice it says they found none. For many had bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Then some rose up and bore false witness, saying against him, well, we heard him say, I'll destroy the temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But not even then did these testimonies agree. So however long this second trial took before the religious leaders, know this, they couldn't get two people to lie together. They couldn't get two liars to agree. They brought in lots of guys. What did you hear? What did he say? And nothing was working. Everything was just kind of falling apart, Even their lying witnesses couldn't get their stories together. Verse 58 tells us that one person came back and they quoted something that Jesus had said 3.5 years earlier. And you can read about it in John chapter 2, but you remember that when the Lord had cleansed the temple the first time, and they asked him, by what authority do you come in here and cause this kind of havoc? Jesus had said, well, if you'll destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it up. And they said, well, it took 46 years to build this temple. And you're going to raise it up in 3 days? And John writes in commentaries, he spoke about this temple of his body, and when he was raised from the dead, the disciples remembered and they believed the scriptures that had spoken about Jesus. Well, somebody had heard that or had gotten out, and it had become a story. And so the Annas family, still chafing over how the Lord had interrupted their business twice, here comes one guy, and maybe several guys in verse 57 and 58, who kind of told parts of that story, but they couldn't even tell it straight, right? They couldn't even agree. And when they told it, they kind of twisted it. Because the Lord never said, destroy this physical temple that I'm cleaning, and in 3 days I will raise it up. He was speaking about his spiritual body, his resurrection from the dead. That would be a sign to them of his authority. I'm the Lord. That's why I'm here to cleanse the temple. This is my place of worship. So they didn't get it. They misquoted it. They twisted it. They couldn't find anyone to agree together at all. But if you made any mention of the fact that you are, worried about the temple or any kind of violence against the temple, they tried to make something out of that whole idea, because to them the temple was holier sometimes than anything else. In fact, you might remember in Acts 6 when Stephen gets up to share. He began to speak to them about the temple. And he mentions the temple there. And then they said to him, "This man does not cease speaking blasphemous words against this holy place." They loved the place. They made it a religious icon as a place as opposed to their hearts. So they had sought Stephen's death based solely on his speech against, in one way, the temple itself. In any event, verse 59 says they couldn't find two people to agree together at all. And so Caiaphas is kind of miffed, He's got a bunch of religious guys around there. He's got a bunch of voting members around there. It's the middle of the night. Annas has kind of done the formal investigation, didn't find nothing. Sent him off to Caiaphas, "You handle this, I'm going to bed." And now he can't seem to get any answers at all either. Meanwhile, the Lord is, red-faced for being slapped in it and questioned again and again and has done nothing wrong at all. Verse 60 says, "And the high priest, then Caiaphas, stood up in the midst of them, and he said to Jesus, 'Do you not answer anything? What is it that these men are testifying against you?' But Jesus, notice verse 61, he's silent, doesn't say anything. Now, look, nobody's proven anything. They can't even agree as to what day he was there, or what he might have said, or where he might have gone. Here's the deal. Here's the legal deal. Case dismissed. There's no evidence. Let him go. And so the Lord says nothing. He just doesn't respond. There's no reason to respond. This is illegal. The proof isn't there. And even Caiaphas trying to chide Jesus. "Hey, you hear what they're saying? You hear what they're saying about you? You sure you don't want to say something in your defense?" It was interesting when we were at the city council a few years ago looking into building a parking garage on the corner here, which we got approval to do and then ran into lots of red tape that would have cost way too much money. But we had a hearing at the city council where people came from the community, 7 or 8 of them, and said, "Oh, that church doesn't care about us, and they don't take care of their property." And they said some pretty wicked things, and I had to sit through all of that because it wasn't true, at least not in my eyes. And one of the council members said to me at the end of this, 30 minutes of that, "Pastor, would you like to say anything?" I said, "Nah, we'll just live on our reputation. Really no reason to try to defend something. You argue against the lies and you just kind of let it go," which we did. We didn't go that route, but in any event, there's nothing good about, being accused, but look what this guy says. "Jesus, do you hear what they're saying about you?" "Yeah, I hear they're saying nothing." "Well, I hear what that guy, yeah, he doesn't agree with that guy. He doesn't say blue shirt, green hat, nothing's right, everything's wrong. I'm not the suspect, I didn't fit the profile." It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit at all. So he says nothing. Well, then, in his frustration, and because they weren't taking no for an answer at this point, we read here in verse 61 that again then the priests asked him, the high priest, and he said to him, "Are you then the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Are you the Messiah, the one that is to come?" And Jesus spoke up and he said, "I am." Ego ime, right? It's that declaration in John's gospel, and especially he uses it 7 times, attached to Exodus chapter 12. So I am. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Putting Jesus under oath, asking him a direct question, he asked him about his claims to be God. Now in John chapter 10, in Jerusalem during the Feast of the Dedication a year ago, they had asked the Lord about that, and he had said that he was the Messiah, that he was God. He had made the claim clearly, and not only carefully, but extremely clearly, "I and the Father are one." And they took up stones to stone him. And he said, "Which good work are you stoning me for?" And they said, "We're not going to stone you for doing a good work. We're going to stone you because you're a man, and yet you claim to be God." And that was something that Jesus had had claimed and people had understood it. People that say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Oh, read your whole Bible. It's in there more than once. Well, so that's the question now asked by this high priest. It's not really a charge that's going to help him with Rome any, because the Romans worshipped 1,000 gods. God, okay, great, now we have 1,001. It wouldn't have moved them, but in his frustration, and this was certainly an irritant to them, that he asked Jesus about his claim to be the Messiah, and Jesus, readily admits to the fact that that's who he is, and he asserts it with distinction and with boldness. He quotes directly out of Daniel chapter 7, which there are two verses in verse 13 and 14 where Daniel said, I looked in the night vision, and behold, I saw one as the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days. They brought him near. He was given dominion and a kingdom and authority, and peoples and nations and languages will come to him. His dominion will be everlasting. It won't pass away. His kingdom won't be destroyed. And it was this wonderful prophecy of the coming one to rule. And Jesus said, that's me. Identified himself. I'm Daniel 7:13. Put the hat on. This is me. I claim that to be me. I am the Son of God who will rule and reign and will judge the nations. And then the high priest tears his clothes. Unfortunately, it doesn't say socked himself in the head. And he says, what further need have we of witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Really? I wonder, and you read the words are. Now, there are a couple of folks that belong to that Sanhedrin that we wonder about. Joseph of Arimathea was a Sanhedrin member. So was Nicodemus. The word is all. It either means they were there and they voted along with everyone else to have him killed, or it was just all that were there. And my personal opinion is that neither one of them could have voted for this at that point. But we don't know. I am amazed at verse 63 where the high priest says, well, we don't need any more witnesses. No, you need one witness, you liar. Well, we don't need any more witnesses. No, you don't have any witnesses. But the rest, in a fit of religious rage, lash out at Jesus, and he needs to die. And verse 65, some of them then began to spit on Jesus, and then they blindfolded him. They began to beat him. They said to him, prophesy to us, tell us something. And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. So in their demonic state, they blindfold Jesus, they mock him, they spit on him, they act in their religious nonsense, these sadistic, demonic hearts bent on brutality. I don't know if you've ever got, hit in the head, but, the Lord made our bodies pretty miraculously. We have a lot of reflex actions that you have no control over. If something's coming at you and you see it, your head will move before you ever think, I should duck. You just react, right? It's a good thing the Lord builds you that way. And if it's moving quickly from the opposite direction, your eyes see it, your eyes will immediately blink or close to protect themselves. God has made us marvelously so. You can roll with the punches because you see them coming. It's a natural instinct. Played a lot of golf over the years, and at least for a while, the big jokes was have exploding golf balls. And you'd hit them with a driver, and you'd literally jump out of your shoes, you don't expect it, and you don't see it coming. Or you get blindsided. A quarterback in football, he can lose his career just because he didn't see it coming. Well, here's Jesus. Blindfolded and hit in the face, taking the full brunt of it all, unable to recoil or to lessen the blows. When you get to Isaiah and you read in chapter 52, verse 14, that to look at Jesus, he was marred more than any man, his form more than the sons of man. And Isaiah goes out of his way to say, by the time Jesus is crucified, you couldn't recognize him for who he was. It started here. It started here. I did not hide my face from their shame and from their spitting. Isaiah chapter 50 starts here. But this is the path that the Lord has chosen for him. I don't know how you handle unfair persecution. I don't know if you're one who's prone to want to just fight back or strike back. Jesus took it all, and he didn't deserve any of it. At least we sometimes deserve part of it. He deserved none of it, right? His body is broken for us, despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He suffered for us. It'll be fulfilled completely by the time Pilate has him scourged, and Jesus has no sin to confess, and so they don't quit beating him at all. Luke says in chapter 22, I think it's verse 65, of this time, and many other things did they say blasphemously to him, and Luke isn't willing to even write them down. You know, this was a disgrace. It was disgusting to him. Meanwhile, notice the high priest sits back. You know, he's in charge of the situation. He thinks he wants to get this together. Like I said, the charge of blasphemy won't stick because the Romans don't care. So they're going to spin this into, being an enemy of the state. He wants to replace Caesar. He says he's the king of his own nation. He doesn't really have any respect to pay taxes. And they work real hard to make this, but their frustration was who he is, what he's done, what he's said, and who he's proven himself to be. Meanwhile, in his love for us, Jesus continues. And we will pick up the story next week, but by the time that dawn is breaking, they will be meeting again in an official capacity to vote, to sign off on this death warrant, if you will. And meanwhile, the Lord, just in his love, heads for the cross. He's the servant. He's the Savior. He's got a price to pay. He's willing to do it, dying to ourselves or he dies to himself for our sake. Amazing, don't you think? How much you're worth to him. Now, we're going to be interrupted next week by Peter. Before we get to trial 3, which starts in verse 1 of chapter 15, we're going to be interrupted by Peter, who has a rendezvous with self-awareness. He didn't think he knew himself well, but by the end of that day, he'll learn. Father, as we sit together this morning, may you move our hearts with gratitude, knowing how much you have given for our lives, what you have sacrificed, what you have paid, so that we would have life. And then this morning that it is early and it's raining and maybe we're just half here, but Lord, how much you've loved us, how much you've given for us so that we could have life. How amazing, Lord, that you would go to this length, that you would pay this kind of price, that you would take it this far, that you would bear up under all of the abuse because you wanted to save us. And we watch your comportment in these trials. We watch the religious men being anything but. We will see the political people having cowardice of heart and self-serving agendas. And yet in the midst of that is our holy God, paying the price, standing where we should stand, taking the brunt and the full weight of our sin so that we don't have to go to hell. We get to go to heaven. We're not lost. We're going to be found and saved and have a future and a hope. And if nothing else, don't lose track and sight. It's good to have the history. It's good to have them in a chronological order to the best that we can. It's good to know the story well and to think through the circumstances. But on the other side, there's still that picture of Jesus going to save. This is the purpose I've come. This is the reason I sweat great drops of blood for 3 hours in the middle of the night, so that I might go forward and redeem mankind, bring life to those who will call upon my name. And that offer is still good this morning. You can have life from Jesus. You can have salvation from him. Where you've gone, what you've done, God can rescue you. He can take you and put your feet on the solid rock of his work and of his love. And notice when Jesus' questions, when it comes to who he is, he has no problem telling you and telling them, this is why I've come, this is who I am. Without him, you can't get to heaven. Without him, there's no forgiveness. You can't work your way to heaven. You can't do good enough to be the substitute for his blood. It was shed because there's no other way. So if you don't have Jesus in your heart, come and pray with one of the pastors up in the front this morning. Invite Jesus to come and save you. Do it now. And God will save you now. Because that's his greatest concern. That's the most important thing that he can give you. A way out of sin, a forgiveness, and then life. And if you know the Lord this morning, may he remind you this week of what the price tag was on your life and what he was willing to pay. You are certainly worth it to him. Shall we stand?